Imagine being so engrossed in your own work and your own creative process that you lose track of where you are and you end up falling off of a roof. I'm the Classical Nerd, and today we're talking about Bohuslav Martinů. I think that's how you pronounce his name. Martinů was born on the Bohemia-Moravia border, in the town of Polička, in December 1890, in the tower of the local church where his father worked part-time. As a child, he was so sickly that his family wondered if he'd even survive. He was incapable of walking up the steps into their apartment, and he had to be carried by his father most of the time. He would later attribute a perceived sense of objectivity in his music to his childhood home, where most human activity was viewed from afar. Martinů actually had Asperger's syndrome, which was unknown during his lifetime. That was determined by looking at his life and the stories about him from a historical perspective, and the evidence is significant. He was extremely shy in school and did not like interacting with his classmates. The only thing he really was into was music, and he was a talented student of the violin. But when he went off to the Prague Conservatory to study beginning in 1906, he turned out to be an atrocious student, much to the chagrin of all the people in his hometown who pitched in money to get him to go there. Yes, his education was crowdfunded. He did not adapt well to the curriculum and its rigidity of structure, and the long and grueling hours of practice one would have to put in order to be a great violinist. Composition caught his ear when he attended concerts with his roommate, another violinist, and then back in their room would just transcribe the pieces that he heard, like one does. His speech was always slow and thoughtful, and despite his violinist training, rarely appeared as a soloist due to his extreme stage fright. Martinů spent 4 years in Prague, but was finally kicked out of the conservatory in 1910 for negligence in his studies, after which he moved back to Polička. He had always adhered to the orderliness of his own schedule, and he could not get himself to adapt to another's. However, he was still interested in composition and had been in contact with Josef Suk, a big name in Czech music, partially because he was the great Antonin Dvořák's son-in-law. As World War I raged, Martinů taught and studied in his hometown, waiting for the time in which he could get his big break. As it happened, the end of World War I and newly independent Czechoslovakia was the impetus for his 1918 piece, Czech Rhapsody. It helped that he was a second violinist in the Czech Philharmonic, and the conductor sometimes programmed his new works. He was also now free to study one-on-one with Josef Suk, but Suk just didn't bring the kind of education that he was looking for. But Martinú's real compositional life would not begin until 1923, when he moved to Paris and began studying with Albert Roussel, who was equally fluent in both the Impressionism of Debussy and of Ravel, and the more angular neoclassicism of the contemporary Stravinsky. Roussel seemed to realize that Martinů would not flourish under a traditional compositional regimen, and so his lessons were more about general trends and styles, as opposed to specific compositional techniques. He had more than enough in the music around him to start experimenting in his own style, and the pieces that he wrote during this period are a combination of angular and machine-driven rhythms combined with Czech folk tunes, as he was never far from his homeland for very long. By 1930, his experimentation ended, and he had settled in on what had become the definitive Martinů idiom, neoclassicism. He was now a well-known figure not just in Czechoslovakia, but around Europe. A chance meeting with the conductor Sergei Koussevitzky in a cafe netted him not just a contact with a famous conductor, but performances of his works by Koussevitzky-led ensembles. It seemed as though Martinú's star was only rising. But then the preamble to World War II came, and he was caught up in the political strife. When Nazi Germany successfully annexed German-speaking areas of Czechoslovakia, and the major European powers signed on in an ultimately fruitless act of appeasement, the Czechs themselves decided to take direct action and organized into resistance forces. While Martinů was never in good enough shape to actually fight alongside them, he was with them in spirit and composed pro-resistance music that got him the attention of the Nazis. And obviously not in a good way. He and his wife were able to escape Paris before the Nazi occupation, and were able to make it to the United States in 1941. On one occasion, they left their apartment the day before the Gestapo busted in. He had a few connections in America, but he had landed in the busiest part of New York, and its hustle and bustle day in and day out constantly was just not something that was conducive to his compositional process. but his friends helped translate things and helped him to move to a less noisy part of town, where he was again able to compose. His actual method of composition was extremely unusual. Instead of sitting down with some paper and a pencil and a piano, he would work everything out in his head as he went on long walks. He would completely zone out, and he would end up, when he came back to the real world, in a part of town he likely didn't recognize. On a couple of occasions, he had to call up some of his friends, describe where he was, in the middle of the night, mind you, and they had to try to figure out where he was based on his descriptions, come pick him up, and take him back to his apartment. This nearly killed him, for after the war, when Koussevitzky invited him to teach at the Tanglewood Institute in the Berkshire Mountains, he went on a walk out on his balcony, somehow made his way onto the roof, forgot where he was, fell off, down a full story, onto his head, onto concrete, and somehow he didn't die. His wife, whose relationship with him was strained at best, reported that he was a different person after he woke up from his coma. And really, you can't blame him. This left him in a lot of pain over the next couple of years, and he was partially deaf in one ear from then on because of it. His wife, who was French, very much wanted to return to her homeland, and Martinů strongly considered returning to his. But the communist regime that had taken over Czechoslovakia did not like him at all. He had no friends in the government, which meant no protection from the censorship of a regime that did not like him and did not like his style of music. He was more than happy to stick around America and teach a great number of composers of all nationalities and compositional proclivities, from his posts at Mannes and Princeton and Curtis, and of course at the Summers in Tanglewood. But in 1953, the year after his naturalization as a United States citizen, he ended up leaving the United States for Europe, where he taught around the continent in various positions until his death from stomach cancer in August of 1959. It took 20 years for his remains to be reinterred in his hometown of Policzka. Martinú's public perception has sometimes been skewed because he was a composer who wrote so much. He was so productive and prolific that those looking at his collected work might see him as someone who favored quantity over quality. But those who knew him knew better. This included the composer David Diamond, to whom Martinů subletted his apartment in the mid-1950s, and he said that Martinů could write so much music so quickly because of his incredible mental capacity, especially his incredible capacity to orchestrate. His mind went very, very fast when it came to music, and he was always working on it on some level. So him writing a piece down was the last step in the process. The piece was done. If you don't look at his works carefully, you can sometimes have a hard time understanding his real place as an artist in the annals of music history, especially because his influences were so wide, which included folk tunes and jazz and a bunch of other contemporary styles. Martinú's orchestral works are also always characterized by the presence of one particular instrument, the piano. But these weren't piano concerti. He was using it as an orchestral instrument, which is not the easiest thing to do. The piano falls squarely in the category of instruments that don't necessarily blend with the rest of the orchestral sound. What's meant by not blending is just that the instrument happens to have such a unique and distinct sound, separate from all the standard instruments in the orchestra, that if you play it alongside orchestral instruments, you're going to hear the piano. The same is true for even things like the oboe, which is a standard orchestral instrument. Some instruments just work better with other instruments than others, and part of the challenge of orchestration is finding ways for things to balance like this. As a result, pieces that use an orchestral piano can often sometimes come across sounding like their piano concerti unintentionally. That is, if the composer's not careful, and Martinů always was. A long story short, as a result of this, most of the time when you hear a piano, it's in a soloistic context, and you have to be very, very careful as a composer to use it in a way that blends in well with the rest of the orchestral sound, and Martinů always was very careful with how he used it. This use is especially intriguing because he never wrote for these late Romantic, Mahler-sized orchestras. And it's even more telling that the largest symphony ever written by any composer, Havergal Brian's first symphony, subtitled The Gothic, which has 5 choirs, that piece does not even use an orchestral piano. Sure, it's got 5 choirs, but doesn't have an orchestral piano, which speaks to how unusual this is when you're talking about orchestras. The fact that Martinů always was able to not just use this, but use it well, speaks to his prowess and his uniqueness as an orchestrator. He always made a point of including it, which helped him to establish his own unique sound. Ballet was a frequent subject of Martinú's pen, especially in his early years, as was the genre of the symphony, which cropped up more in his maturity. He was good for about one a year in the mid-1940s. His music is supposedly neoclassical, but that's just a bad name for that genre. Sure, people call it neoclassical, but it really is more neo-baroque than anything else. Composers did not look to the classical era necessarily for their inspiration. They could, but it's really kind of a specific term that implies something different than what the majority of it really is. Also, Martinú's works are frequently ametrical. That is, their phrase lengths are not determined by their metrical patterns. For instance, you might find a more four-square, 8-bar, 16-bar phrase in a Haydn symphony or a Mozart sonata, and you won't find that kind of metrical regularity in something by Martinů, even if he's trying to evoke the classical era. Because of the political situation and his long exile from his own homeland, Martinů is a rather unusual figure of music history. He called himself a man without a country. Even his reputation in his homeland was maligned, as it wasn't until well after his death that his music began to be accepted by the Czech people once again, and this had everything to do with the communist regime that did not like him and did not like his love of contemporary French composers. To his fans and to his supporters, he was the 20th century's version of Dvořák, a broadly talented and prolific composer proud of his Czech heritage. "Music must be beautiful," Martinů once wrote, "or it wouldn't be worth the effort."